Okay, you guys ready?
Yeah.
Christy, you ready?
Sure.
You're born. You're not born anymore. You're just kind of, yeah, whatever.
You'll fix it in the editing, right?
I'm not making that mistake again.
Well, hello and welcome once again to the DCL podcast, where we're inviting you to sit back, relax, and we'll be on our way shortly. Well, welcome back to the DCL podcast, your podcast to help you and your families cruise a little smarter next time. And I'd like to welcome back to the show Christy from Pack Your Pixie Dust. How you doing today, Christy?
I am well. How are you?
Not too bad. And I think we are changing the ship around. We're going to take a look at one of our favorite topics today.
Adventures by Disney.
Exactly. Adventures by Disney, and specifically, and we have not talked about this really, I don't think, is talking about a river cruise, an ABD river cruise, have we?
I don't believe we have. I'm excited about the topic.
Yeah, same here. And we've got a long-time good friend of the show, Frank, who's going to join us, and we'll get him on here in just a second. But I thought we'd just do a quick overview of what ABD offers as far as river cruises go. It's operated by AMA Waterways, and these ships were specifically built for AMA Waterways to provide cruises for Disney, I guess. And I'm sure.
Well, I'm going to interrupt you. The Danube and the Rhine River Cruise ships were, but not the Seine River Cruise, which is actually the river we're going to talk about today. Because the Seine, it's one of their older ships, and it was before Adventures by Disney started their partnership with AMA Waterways. Because of the restrictions on the size of the river, they can't do one of the newer, bigger ships. Okay, perfect. Well, that's good information there. So they are operated by a separate company, AMA Waterways, which I believe, doing the research on it, they are probably the top river cruising. They are in the top section. There are some that may be a little bit above them in like an ultra luxury. Well, there are some ultra luxury, but they are a higher end. They're Disney equivalent on the river.
Okay. And just to kind of give you an idea of some of the different cruises that they have that ABD offers right now, they offer four different rivers. So the first one being the Rhine River Cruise, where they have not just the regular river cruise, but they also have a couple specialty sailings, or one specialty sailing, which focuses on food and wine. Then we have the Danube River Cruises, where they have just the river cruise itself. And then there's two specialty cruises, one that focuses on the Christmas markets in the November and Christmas timeframe, and then also Oktoberfest, which is going on here now in September. Then they also have the Rhone River Cruise, and I believe the Seine was the latest one that they've started offering, right?
Yes. Well, no, the Rhone is the newest one for this year. The Seine, this summer, that the cruise Frank went on was the first year that they were offering them. Okay. And speaking of Frank, I'd like to welcome back to the show, good friend of the show, Frank. How are you doing today, Frank?
I'm doing great, thanks.
Well, thanks for coming on, and thanks for biting the bullet and going on this cruise and this trip.
Thanks for doing it for us.
It was a terrible sacrifice, but somebody had to do it.
So, no, I really appreciate you, coming on and talking about your and your wife's experience as far as your Seine River Cruise. So, well, let's just jump into it. Why did you guys decide, and this is your first Adventures by Disney adventure, right?
Yes, it is.
So why did you want to start off with a river cruise and maybe this one in general?
Well, I think doing a river cruise has sort of always been on our bucket list. My wife and I had always talked about we'd like to do a river cruise in Europe. It was sort of almost by accident that we ended up finding this one. I'm hooked up with all sorts of Disney promotional emails, and so I get all kinds of stuff. When they announced the Seine River Cruise, I happened to get an email about it, and it was something that we had talked about doing. And then I looked at the dates, and the dates for the cruise we took covered our wedding anniversary.
Oh.
So sort of looked at that and said, okay, we're talking, we usually do an anniversary trip every year. This seems like a great one to do. It's something we want to try. And we've heard about Adventures by Disney. We see the advertisements for them, on the ocean cruises and sort of all over the place. So sort of serendipity all came together there, and it just seemed like the perfect choice.
So talking about Adventures by Disney, before we jump into yours, Christy, could you talk a little bit, and we don't have to go into like all the details, but just kind of the main details of the difference between a land and a river cruise as far as just the number of people and whatnot?
Frank may be better suited to tell me the exact number, but it's about 160, between 120 and 180 people total per river ship. They are much smaller. They literally traverse the rivers that you would like walk over, and they park right in the cities. It is not like a cruise ship. They have typically 1 to 2 entertainment spaces where they'll have all of the meals, and then if they're going to do entertainment or they're going to do a chat or they're going to do a talk, they're all in the same areas. Some of the riverboats don't even have elevators. So, or some of them will only have elevators that get to certain floors. So these are very small ways to move about a river so that you can really be in the town. It's an immersive experience. And there'll be times where you could be doing an excursion and still during the day, and your riverboat will be in a different location.
We had that happen to us a couple of times where we got off at one place, went off, did the excursion, and then ended up back at another place to pick up the boat. So if you look at the ship that we were on, it actually had 3 decks, and then it also had an outside deck on top that had like lounge chairs and a hot tub and that sort of thing. And there were staterooms on probably 2.5 of those decks. No elevators, it was just stairs. And I wrote this down because they announced it at one point. There were 111 people on our trip, so that was the size of the group.
And one thing about the river ship that is being used for the Seine is because Disney commissioned and worked with AMA to make these and want families to be welcomed, for the newer ships that they have, they really worked with them. Like there's a pool on the newer ships, but the ship that's being used for the Seine does not have connecting rooms, does not have availability in any room for more than 2 people, and does not have a swimming pool. So like Frank said, they have a hot tub, but that's the differences between this riverboat. It is an older one versus the newer ones that are being built for the other rivers.
Right. So there were a number of families that were on the trip that we were on, and they ended up occupying multiple staterooms in order to have space for everybody.
I feel like that works if you're a family of 4. But honestly, I don't know, Steve, if you remember, but when they first came out with this, I was like, oh my gosh, I want to do this. I wanted to do this cruise for my family. But as soon as I started looking at that boat, I was like, well, that's not going to work because
you guys
I don't
are a
want to
family
sleep
of
in a
3.
different room. We're a family of 3. And I don't want to sleep in a different room as Dave and my husband. And obviously my son can't be in a different room. So it'll work if you had older kids and there was more of them or something. But I don't know. I find a family of 3 to be tricky.
Well, that just means you've got one extra space to take somebody else with, so you could take me. And Dave and I could room.
Sure. Did not expect that.
Well,
I don't know if those beds split apart, Steve. So.
Yeah, you got that problem. You guys can cuddle.
Yeah. Well, okay, so that's kind of an overview of the river cruises. The difference between one of the land cruises is the land cruises are a lot smaller, and in the land cruises, you kind of all do think, well, this is a generalized statement. They are a little bit different, but in the land cruises, you kind of all do things together in one big group. In the river cruises, you can kind of split up and do different things as you get to the different ports. So, good overview of kind of the river ship itself and the cruise. Well, before we jump into itself, Frank, how did ABD prepare you guys for the cruise? Now, I know you guys are big planners. You did a lot of probably research as far as where you're going, what you wanted to do, what you wanted to see. What were some of the things that Adventures by Disney provided for you guys to plan for this cruise?
At some point before the cruise, and I can't remember exactly when this was, I think it was a few months before, they sent out a booklet that's a lot like the booklet that Disney Cruise Line used to send out, spiral bound with a lot of information in it. And with that was a listing of the itinerary for each of the days, descriptions of the activities, and then a form that they had to put what your top choice would be for each of the particular days or half days that you were on the trip. So there were some days, like, for example, the day that we went to the World War II sites and Omaha Beach and all that, where everybody did the same thing. But then there were other days where you had some choices, and there may be 2 or 3 things to choose from in the morning, a couple of things to choose from in the afternoon. So that was sort of helpful in terms of being able to sit down and read about these places and see, okay, that sounds like someplace I'd really like to see versus I'm not quite so interested in that. The other thing that comes before the trip is basically a little gift box. In the box, we received ABD luggage tags and actually a very nice ABD backpack that we ended up using quite a bit on the trip. So we had that to come along with us as well. The thing that was interesting about all of this is when we got to check in for the first day of our trip in Paris, they gave us a revised itinerary, and they had shifted a lot of stuff around. So we actually ended up doing everything that we thought we were going to do from the beginning, but some things switched like from day 3 to day 8 or something like that. And so it wasn't exactly in the order that they had initially told us we were going to do things. And the sense that I got is that they're still working out some kinks with this trip. And they're still trying to figure out what the best way is to do certain things. My suspicion is that next year, when they're doing it a lot, they will kind of have this down and it'll be a little more smooth. And in fact, one of the things that the guides were asking us periodically throughout the trip is if anybody sort of wandered off and tried something different on their own, they wanted to know how that was, and they wanted to know whether that was a good experience or something they should recommend.
Interesting. So this is the second year they've operated it, and they're still kind of, trying to feel it out and come up with
I actually think it's the first year.
Oh, it's the first year.
Okay. Yeah.
I apologize. Okay, so the first year they operated, so they're really looking for you guys' feedback to pass it on and maybe build on in the future.
The thing with river cruises also, though, is that they are a little bit more fluid where things will change. Well, and obviously, in this particular one, Disney is still trying to find their footing. But because the river lengths or the river rises and lowers, they will actually alter the cruise based on what is happening with the river. And just for people to note, there are certain times where the river is just low, and they actually have to move people by bus instead of river ship, just so people are aware that that is always a possibility with a river cruise. One
of the other things that we had the opportunity to see, and I actually took a video of this, was the Seine has some locks that you go through. So at certain points, the river is at very different heights, and you may have to go up or down. And so we were able to experience that, which was kind of fun. The other thing that people may be interested in is my wife gets horribly seasick on just about any boat she ever goes on, but had no issues at all with the river cruise, didn't use any of her usual seasickness medication, felt fine the whole time. In fact, most of the time that we're on the boat, the only reason we knew we were moving is you'd look out the window and see things going by.
Let's jump into the cruise itself. So it's a 10-day cruise. It starts in Paris. And looking at it, just to kind of go through the itinerary quick, it looks like you had 3 days in Paris. And if you could help me with some of these names, Frank. But you start off 3 days in Paris, then you're down to Les Andelys, Le Havre. Did I say that right? I'm not sure.
I believe so.
Okay. And that's where, just for other people's information, that's where the Disney Magic usually stops when they stop in France. And from there you go to Le Havre. Oh boy, this one's going to mess me up. I can't even say it, Le Havre.
Maybe Frank can say that.
Do you remember?
I'm not sure about the name of the town. I mean, the place that we went from there was Etretat, which is where the cliffs are, but the name of that port, I'm not even going to try.
Yeah, I'm not. I don't. You're going to have to, for everybody that speaks French, you can Google it under Adventures by Disney, or look it up under Adventures by Disney. Then you go to Rouen, Vernon, and then back to Paris. So let's kind of talk about it. You guys get to Paris, and how does the river cruise start?
The way the trip is set up, there is a particular day that they expect that you will arrive in Paris. There were some people that had come in a day or two earlier and had arranged to have a hotel a few days in Paris before the trip actually started. But we did what I think is the typical arrival, where we had an overnight flight that landed in Paris in the morning. It was actually one of the most wonderful aspects of the ABD trip. I was really impressed with how they handled that, because we arrived, we went through, we got our luggage. As soon as we walked through the door out from the luggage area, there was a driver who was there in a full tuxedo, sign with our name on it. We had expected that there would probably be a group of people that were on the trip that they would sort of gather up and take into the city. But nope, we were whisked off to this luxurious black Mercedes. We were the only folks in the car, and sort of had our private ride into Paris, arrived at the hotel. When we got to the hotel, the adventure guides, who are the ABD guides that are part of the trip, were set up. They had a hospitality desk in the lobby, got us signed in, got our name tags, our packets for the trip, all those sorts of things. And then we had a couple of days that were part of the trip in Paris before we ended up getting on the river cruise.
What hotel did they have you stay at in Paris?
So it was called the Hilton Paris Opera.
Okay, that is where they stayed for their week-long ABD trip. I assume that's in like the opera area or whatever that part
it
of it
is.
Okay.
It's right by the old opera house and train station and those sorts of things.
So you had 2 days in Paris. So did they do, is that what you said? 2 nights?
Yes, 2 nights at the hotel.
Did they have you doing all then the Eiffel Tower and the Louvre and stuff like that as part of those 2 days?
Right. So the first day is really just the arrival day. So there wasn't anything that really happened until that evening. And then that evening they had a welcome dinner in the hotel and everybody sort of got to know each other. And then the next day they started with the activities. And so there was the option to go to the Louvre. There was the option to do some walking tours, some gourmet food tours. There was another museum, the Musée d'Orsay, which was available on one of the days. And the Eiffel Tower was on everybody's itinerary. So regardless of what you did on any of the other pieces of the trip during those couple of days, everybody had a stop at the Eiffel Tower to get their picture taken there.
And kind of looking at it, almost the stuff that was available on the second day's afternoon was available on the third day's morning. So it looked like they really kind of set it up so that you could do all of it if you wanted to. Does that make sense?
They did.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is they had one evening that was just on your own. They didn't have a dinner planned or anything like that. That was something that people did various things during. So there were some folks that decided, we want to actually go to the Eiffel Tower and go up the tower. And so they did that evening. That evening happened to be our anniversary. And so I had sort of scoured all sorts of online sites and recommendations and things like that. And we ended up finding this very little bistro a couple of blocks from the hotel that had about 8 or 10 tables. We were the only people in there that were not native French speakers. And so I figured that was the right place to be. And Steve, we had escargot, and it was magnificent.
I love it. I'm guessing it's probably a little bit better.
The presentation was amazing because I actually served them in the shells. So,
oh, wow.
It looks beautiful. It was a little more work to actually get them, but it was really good.
Well, what just a magical start to you guys' vacation there, as far as having your anniversary, the two of you, just a beautiful, French bistro under the stars.
Absolutely.
So
the only thing I will say is that I am really happy that we were not in Paris a couple of weeks before we were, because I don't know if you remember, they had temperatures like over 100 degrees. The week that we were there, it was actually sort of in the high 70s, low 80s, and it was still pretty warm. Most places in Paris actually are not air conditioned. The hotel was, but a lot of the other places were not. And so I can't imagine being there when it's ridiculously hot like it had been.
We actually had some friends on board the Magic that did the cruise from Barcelona up to England, and they were in France and then over in England during that time. And they said it was crazy. I remember seeing a picture. They had a picture from his iPhone screenshot of 100 degrees in London. So I'm glad you guys didn't have to face those temperatures. Before we go into the river part, any highlights you want to talk about of your time in Paris? Or had you been there before?
I had been to Paris before. Karen, my wife, had not. I think really our anniversary dinner was a highlight, much more so than anything else. I think one of the things that ends up happening is, because they want you to see as many things as you possibly can, sometimes you feel sort of rushed through things. So if you really wanted to see the Louvre, for example, you probably need several weeks. We're there for half a day. And so it really is just sort of the highlights of each thing. And unfortunately, there's limited opportunity to sort of linger anywhere or do something for a longer period of time than they have scheduled, because you're basically going on to the next thing. But we enjoyed being there, and it was fun to be in Paris. But if I'm going to be honest about it, I really enjoyed the countryside and the smaller towns and those sorts of things much more than the big city.
What was the name of the restaurant you went to?
It was called Bistro Albert.
And do you recall where it was located?
It was about a 5 to 10 minute walk from the hotel. I don't remember the exact address.
Oh, perfect. Well, then people can look that up. So,
right.
Awesome.
Well, let's move into the river cruise part itself. You gave them one question I have before we talk about some of the cabins and the food stuff. You kind of, fill out that checklist ahead of time so they get an idea of what people want to do. And then once you get on the actual, adventure itself, are you able to change up what you want to do kind of on the fly? So like, say, tomorrow we're all going to go to this museum, but there's also this cheese tasting, and you decide, I want to do the cheese tasting instead. Can you do that?
Yeah, absolutely. And we did that at least once, and there were a lot of people who did that several times. Some of it was just based on the weather, how tired they were. Some of it was based on, I'm here and I'm sort of feeling this one more than the other one, and I'd like to make a change. And yeah, that wasn't any problem at all.
One thing we didn't touch on, how many kids do you think were on with you guys?
I would guess that there were probably maybe 10 to 15 sort of what I would consider younger school age kids, and there were probably another 8 to 10 teenagers. It's interesting because they had a lot of activities separate for them. And I didn't fully realize that until the end of the trip, when you get the opportunity to look at and download all the pictures that the guides have been taking through the whole trip. And a number of the pictures were sort of just the kids doing all sorts of things that I had no idea they were doing, but looked like lots of fun.
So it's kind of like being on the regular Disney ships, where sometimes you're in your own little bubble, and there's times where I just remember the very first cruise we did, and as we were leaving, there was like so many families with babies on board. And the whole 7 days we were up in Alaska, I don't think I saw one baby.
Yeah, I don't think there were any babies on this trip, and I think that's
there's a minimum age.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to throw that off the rails there.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, they have a minimum age of 4 and a suggested of 8+ on this particular cruise. So, well, Frank, you've been on all the different ships as far as Disney goes. What was your thoughts as you guys got on board? And I believe this was the Lyra?
Yes. Well, I had seen pictures of the ship and deck plans and those sorts of things. I thought it was a very comfortable ship. It was obviously very easy to find your way around because it's not a very big ship. I thought the staterooms themselves were very reasonable. They're significantly smaller than the staterooms on the ocean ships. They're basically the width of the bed and a little chair next to the bed, or I guess that's the length, and then the width is basically the bed with some room to walk around it. But they have a desk and a chair and a couple of other chairs to sit in, plus the bed. The bathroom is very small, but it does actually have a real shower with shower doors and all those sorts of things, and one sink, one commode, and it was perfectly functional. The other thing that's interesting to me about this ship, and I don't know if this is true of all of the river ships, is the rooms don't actually have balconies. So there are some rooms that have just windows looking on the outside, and then the rest of the rooms are what they call French balconies. And what that means is they have sliding glass doors that you can open up, and then immediately in front of that is a rail. So you can open it up and let the air in and see outside, and you can lean on the rail and look out, but there's not actually a balcony that you could walk out on or that has chairs that you could sit out on. And that's not true of all ships, because we saw a ship from another liner that did actually have balconies with 2 little chairs and a table like you have on the ocean liners. What I wonder, though, is if their actual staterooms were smaller, because the ships can only be so wide.
Right. They're either going to be smaller, or they're going to have less cabins, or they're going to have less public space. You know, they do figure out, when there's newer ships, different ways to design them. This particular ship is an older one. And so even if you look at older ocean cruise ships, there were less balcony cabins on the older ones. It was like a change in priority, I guess, as time went on for people, that now they're like, oh, wait, yeah, we want to be able to sit on our own private balcony and see out. So
we were able to sort of do that because, again, there were 2 chairs there. And so you could open up the sliders and sit there. And it was almost like being on a balcony. And even though it's an older ship, it really was in very good condition. Everything was spotlessly clean. The public spaces were really very nice. And those included a sort of very large lounge where a lot of things happened. So each day it was where you would gather to go out for whatever you were going to be doing that day. In the afternoon, they would get everyone together and kind of have a recap and then talk about what was going to be happening the next day. They also did other activities in there during the days and in the evenings. Then there was one, down on a lower level, there was one large dining room for the entire ship. And that never seemed too small. It was always really easy to find a place to sit with people that you'd met. There was never really any issue with that. The other thing that they had was a very small exercise facility that had like one set of weights and one bike and one treadmill. And as best I could tell, the most use that place got was that it was where people would walk through to get to the smoking area. And then in the very back of the ship, they have another small dining area that they call the chef's table area, where everyone has the opportunity for one night of the cruise to go back there and have a special dinner that's a little bit more high class and prepared specially for the folks in that dining room on that date.
Can you talk a little bit about how dining works? So you've got the one main dining room. It sounds like you can sit wherever you want to during each one of the sittings. And what was your kind of thought of that and the food in general?
Right. So there's a seating for breakfast. If the ship is somewhere where it's available, there's a seating for lunch and there's a seating for dinner. It's not like they have any separate seatings or anything like that. One of the things that I found out later that they did was sometimes they would take the kids off to sort of have their own meal somewhere else, and I'm not sure where that happened. And then in the main dining room, there was one big table that was always the teen table. And it seemed like all the teens would be sitting there with one of the adventure guides who was brave enough to volunteer to be the teen leader. And I think that allowed for parents and other folks to sort of have a more adult dining experience. We actually really early on the trip connected with another couple that we ended up having dinner with most nights, and that was a lot of fun. The breakfast is a buffet, and then there are several things that you can order off a menu if you want something different, but it's really the basic sort of breakfast things. There's some sort of egg dish, there's bacon, there's sausage, there's fruit. But then the other thing is, because we're in France, there's this wonderful selection of cheeses, and there's the best bread you will ever eat in your life. I think that's the one thing we went through France withdrawal with, is the bread when we got back, because there's just fabulous bread everywhere you go. Then for lunch, if there was lunch on the ship, it would vary from day to day. And they had one day where it was like a barbecue day, and they had barbecued beef and barbecued ribs and other things like that. There was another day when they had escargot, so that was obviously a very popular day for me. That sort of varied, and again was a buffet. And then dinner was a sit-down affair, and it was very similar to dinner on an ocean cruise. They would present you a menu. There would be a selection of a few appetizers, a selection of a few salads and soups, a selection of a few entrees, and then there was always available certain things like a basic steak or basic salmon or something like that. And then it also had a kids menu that usually had burgers, hot dogs, those sorts of things. Again, they also had sort of a separate dinner opportunity for the younger kids in one of the other locations of the ship, if that was something that they would rather do.
How would you characterize the food quality? Kind of similar to the Disney ships, or a little bit better? Obviously, they've got a lot of fresh stuff from the different cities that you stopped into.
Yeah, I think breakfast was pretty similar. I think some of the offerings for lunch and dinner were maybe a little bit higher quality than what you get on the ocean cruises. There was some stuff that was just absolutely outstanding, and then there was some stuff that was, this is fine. I thought the food was very good. I think the food that we got when we were actually off the ship in some of the small bistros and other restaurants and different places that we went was better, but it was certainly really good.
Was the seating, was there a range, or did you have to arrive at a certain time?
What generally happened is there would be a notice that the mass gathering in the lounge for the evening happened at such and such a time. So at 5:45 or 6 o'clock, everybody get together. We're going to go over what the itinerary is for the next day, if you're doing this, where you go, that sort of thing. The other thing we should talk about at some point is the other thing that they always did at that was give out the pin of the day. So every day on an ABD trip, you get a pin. A lot of times they're pins that are sort of themed towards where you are with Disney characters. And so they would do that, and then they would say, okay, it's time for dinner. And whatever time that happened to be, whether it was 6:30, 7 o'clock, something like that, was dinner time.
And just one other thing to throw out there, all of drinks are included as well, too, right, besides the food?
They are. So 24/7, they have availability of coffee, tea, water, and the coffee machines are the kind that make some different things, so they can make a little cappuccino or that sort of thing. Then at the meals, there is always availability of basically whatever you want, including beer and wine.
During meals, could you get liquor if you wanted? Like if somebody wanted whatever type of liquor, mixed drink?
Yes. Actually, you could get that probably not in the morning, but once it got into the afternoon, the large lounge area where they had all the major activities has a bar. And so you could get drinks there. And then during lunch or dinner, you could order a drink that they would make you for an extra charge if you didn't want beer or wine or soda.
Well, anything else, Frank, about the ship itself before, or some of the activities you guys experienced on the ship before we actually turned to the ports themselves and what you did there?
It's interesting because they tried to have some activity every evening, but it's not like on an ocean cruise. So there's not going to be any sort of production show or even, comedians or other sorts of things. One night there was bingo. One night there was trivia. they do have a musician who's on the cruise who plays every evening. And basically that's a solo piano or solo guitar, that sort of thing. So it's certainly not the sort of trip for somebody that's looking for some nightlife, because there really isn't much of that. Now, the piece of that didn't bother us at all is so many of the days were just so busy and so much activity that we would have dinner and then we'd look at each other and say, okay, time for bed, because we got to be up to get off the ship at 8:00 tomorrow morning.
So the other thing I'm kind of thinking about is, before we actually go to the ports, how was it just, sailing down the Seine itself, as far as the scenery and taking that in? That
was really interesting and enjoyable. I think when you're in Paris, getting out of Paris, you go through some industrial areas and things like that. But pretty much from then on, it really is just beautiful countryside and just really interesting little houses and little chateaus and the occasional castle, open fields, all sorts of cows. Apparently cows are very big in the Normandy area, so we saw lots of pastures with cows in them and things like that. So that was really kind of fun, just to sort of sit and watch those things go by, and it's just so different than what you would see, obviously, on an ocean cruise.
Well, let's turn to the ports themselves. So day 4 finds you waking up in Les Andelys. And as we kind of alluded, I guess I'm not sure if we recorded this part, but there's such busy days. I'm not sure if we can do a blow-by-blow of each day. But let's kind of go through the highlights of some of the things that you got to experience in each one of the ports, some of the things that stuck out in your mind.
Les Andelys is this beautiful little town with cobblestone streets, very hilly, and the real highlight is that there's a place called the Chateau Gaillard, which is actually a medieval fortress that's up on a hill. And so the options were to either hike up there or to bike up there. It was actually raining that day, so hiking seemed like a better choice. And I think I sent you some pictures where we're wearing our rain gear because it was a rainy day.
I saw that.
But it was just beautiful when you get to the top of the hill. It's this old medieval fort that is, in some places, very well preserved. In other places, walls have been knocked down and things like that. But there's an opportunity to walk around and see the different things there. And then you really have a view of not only the little town below, but sort of the countryside in all directions. And so that was really the highlight of that day. We really enjoyed that.
Did you guys do the French cheese tasting or the macaron making?
So that was actually something that happened on the ship. Okay. And it was more of the macaron was a demonstration. One of the head pastry chef came out and actually demonstrated how they make macarons. And then we all got to try them. And then there was a table just covered with different French cheeses that we all got to taste. So that was something that everybody did in the afternoon.
Did you let them know that you'd cooked at Palo before? And so...
I did not. Perfectly happy to allow the French chefs to do the things that they do and not try to interfere in any way.
I'm sorry, Frank. I had to throw that out.
No, that's okay.
Excuse me, I've cooked at Palo before. Let me show you how to do this.
No, if I had cooked at Remy before, that would be different. But,
yeah. That's true. I've got my countries mixed up, don't I? Once again, just like I had the golf course mixed up on one of the other shows. So, okay. Well, from there, you guys are on to Le Havre, and that is where you get to experience the Normandy beaches. My wife and I and her stepdad and mom had a chance to go out there, and this is just, I'm a huge World War II history buff, so I'm kind of curious to hear what your thoughts were spending the day there.
I'm a history buff in general, and this to me was just the highlight day of the trip. When I looked at the itinerary and we were deciding whether to do this or not, I looked at and saw that and said, I definitely want to do this. And it was really just an awesome day. We were off the ship at 8 o'clock because it actually took about a couple hours to get to some of these sites from the ship. ABD really shone on this day, and they had everything so well planned. They got the president of the D-Day Society in France as our guide for the day.
Wow.
And he was with us through the entire day with all the places that we went. We started out in the American Cemetery, which is really just very moving to see in person. I think everyone's seen pictures of the rows of crosses and stars and things like that, but to actually stand in the middle of it and be there was amazing. And they had a little ceremony while we were there honoring those that had died in that battle, in the battles there. The next thing that they did, which really, I think this must just be something ABD does, I can't imagine that anybody else is able to pull this off, is through the D-Day Society, they got 5 or 6 vintage military transports. things like Jeeps and armored personnel carriers and stuff like that. And they actually put us in those to transport us down to Omaha Beach.
Wow.
So we got to ride down there in an old amphibious transport. And that was amazing because not only was it just so cool to be in one of those things, but all the folks that were there traveling with other groups or by themselves or things like that were sort of looking at us, and you could tell they were thinking, how the heck did they get to ride in those things? And then it was down to Omaha Beach and had the chance to sort of walk around and get a sense for that place. They took us after that somewhere for lunch because this was an all-day sort of trip, and that was a nice lunch. Then they took us up on the cliffs that the Army Rangers had scaled to try to take out some of the sniper sites. And that, again, was just amazing. I mean, the whole day was just fantastic. And I can't really put into words how moving it was to do all those things.
You know, being with a big group like that, how does ABD kind of attack that, I guess, as far as like when you're with a bigger group, like when we were in Rome and we did a guided tour, they gave out like little earpieces. So when the guide was talking, everybody could hear what they were saying, and it gave you a chance to maybe kind of wander over here or there a little bit. How do they do that with a group like that? Does ABD kind of do the same thing?
So ABD does that in Paris. And then on the river cruise, there are those devices in every stateroom. So they have those available. But one of the things that they do is if it's a place where it really wouldn't work so well to have such a big group, like, for example, when we went to the Louvre, they actually divided us into 3 or 4 different groups, each of which had their own tour guide. And so you were with the yellow group or the purple group or the red group, and they had a paddle. They actually called them lollipops that they would carry around that had your color so you knew which group you were with to get started. And they were able to take those devices and connect them wirelessly. So you could only hear the guide for your group and not all the other guides.
So no problem as far as throughout the trip, you know, being able to hear things that were being said so you didn't feel like you're missing anything.
No, not at all.
Well, from Le Havre, just an amazing time being able to see. We were at the cemetery over Omaha Beach too, and I mean, like you said, words can't describe kind of the feeling that you have thinking about what those young men and some women too kind of went through that day. So
I will admit that I cried.
Yeah.
On more than one occasion. One of the other things that they did before we went out was asked people if they had someone in their family or someone significant to them that had been on Omaha Beach or was buried in the cemetery. And they actually did some special things for those folks and allowed them to do things like lay a wreath or do a little ceremony on the beach, that sort of thing. So that was really moving as well.
Oh, it's amazing that they had that, you know, the forethought to have that available for somebody. Just obviously they must have had people like that there before.
I would assume so. And there were 3 or 4 people that participated in those things on our trip. Yeah, I actually had an uncle who was in the landing on Omaha Beach. Fortunately, was not killed, was injured, and ended up spending the rest of the war in a hospital in England. So that was obviously meaningful as well.
Oh, definitely. Well, from Le Havre, you go to the place that I can't pronounce. So. Day 6, I guess, Le Havre, Croix de Bec, Caux. What did you guys have planned there? What did you guys do?
So that's the name of the port. The town that is associated with that is a little town called Honfleur. And that, I think, was our favorite little town of any of the places that we went. I think that there are popular pictures, postcards of this little town because it's on the water. It's not a port. It's really, what do you call that, where there's an inlet where ships can dock. It's a little inlet there. And then there's a number of buildings along the side that are all various different colors. And it was just a beautiful little town. And we just spent the morning walking around. They gave us a little bit of a walking tour, and then they gave us time on our own. It was a Sunday, and so we actually went to the little church in town and went to Mass because we were there, and we thought that would be an interesting thing to do. And it's a very interesting church because apparently it's the only wooden church in France that survived World War II. All the rest of them were burned. And so that was really neat to see and have a little bit of time to spend there. And then we had lunch on our own, and that may have been one of the highlight meals of our trip. We went to this little cafe, sat in one of the little outdoor seats, and their specialties were crepes and mussels. So we had buckets of mussels and frites, And for dessert, we had buttered salted caramel crepes.
Oh, wow.
And those were some of the most magnificent things I've ever eaten.
Now, for that meal, did you go based on a suggestion from your ABD guide, or did you come up with it on your own?
They had given us several suggestions, and that was one of them. And so that worked out well. The other thing that happened, I think it was that day, it was one of the days where initially there was supposed to be lunch on the boat. And then it worked out that that wasn't going to fit into the way the schedule had changed. And they gave people an envelope, and every person got 25 euros to buy their lunch, which, as far as I can tell, and I talked to people that had been on 10 or 12 different ABD trips, and they said, this has never happened before. They never give you money. So that was nice. It actually covered the cost of our lunch, and was a fantastic meal.
Oh, you're making me hungry with those mussels.
Oh, they were amazing, and it was this huge bucket with this fabulous gravy. It was so good.
I'll let you guys have the mussels.
Frank and I are gonna be fighting over the mussels and the escargot. I think we have similar tastes.
It is all yours.
Garlicky things in shells. I like those a lot.
Definitely. well, anything else from Honfleur before we move on to Rouen?
That day, that was just the morning. We went to a different place in the afternoon on a little bus drive, and this was the cliffs of Etretat, I think is how it's pronounced. And that's an area where there's a beach, and it was one of those places that was occupied by the Nazis during the war. And so a lot of the things there had been destroyed. On either side of the beach, there are these very high cliffs, and one of them has an arch that goes out into the ocean. And I have seen pictures of that arch hundreds of times and had no idea where that was, but this is the place. And so you were able to either stay down on the beach and take in the sights, walk around the little town, or you could climb the cliffs and go up to the top and take in the views from up there. To be honest, we were tired enough at that point that we enjoyed walking around but didn't venture up the cliffs. But that was available for people to do during the afternoon.
And it looks like you guys had a concert that night, one of those onboard entertainment concerts you were talking about?
Yeah, so there was a little concert there. I think we may have heard 30 seconds of it before shuffling off to bed.
Kind of put you to sleep listening to it.
Right.
And I don't mean the music was bad. I don't mean the music was bad. It was
no, the music was fine. It was, again, the days were just so full and lots of walking, which I think is good because the more walking you do, the more bread you can eat. But it's certainly going to make you plenty tired in the evening and ready to go to bed because they're getting you up early the next day.
So from there, you guys are on to Rouen. How did you guys spend your time there?
Rouen, in the morning, there was an option to do a couple of different things. We ended up doing the walking tour, which was really just wonderful. We enjoyed this town quite a bit as well. There's a very large cathedral there, and we had the opportunity to see that cathedral and go in and walk around. Rouen is also where Joan of Arc was burned at the stake. And so we saw the site that as far as everyone who's in the knowledgeable about these things thinks that actually happened. There's another church there. And then there were just some other things that you could see. And we also did, during that morning, part of the walking tour was going to a local chocolate shop and seeing how they actually make the chocolates. And they picked one of the kids out of our group to help them with chocolate making. And so they got to do that, and that was a lot of fun. And then later that day, we wandered around and did some other shopping around the town. That afternoon was the one afternoon that we decided it's time to rest. There was an opportunity to go kayaking, but it had started to rain a little bit. We had initially planned to do the kayaking, but felt like we're just going to get a little bit of rest this afternoon. And part of that was because there was an evening activity that wasn't on any of the itineraries that they added on at the last minute. And that was at 10 o'clock that night. Some of us went off the ship, walked back to the cathedral, and on the front of this huge cathedral, way bigger than like Cinderella's castle or anything like that, they do a projection show. And it was one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. It was very similar to the type of projection show that they do on the castle at Walt Disney World or do on the Tower of Terror at Walt Disney World during Christmas time. But it was way over the top compared to that in terms of showing all sorts of different scenes. It starts with the Vikings actually invading because they had invaded the continent at Rouen, and then sort of goes through a lot of other things that happened historically in the area with all sorts of colors. It was just a fantastic experience.
Was it set to music as well as it was playing?
And it was set to music as well. So that was not something we were expecting. And I'm not sure whether ABD actually knew about that ahead of time, because that was the one excursion that was led by the AMA ship's cruise director, who basically joked throughout the trip that he had nothing to do because ABD took care of everything. But he was the one who actually took us out there for the projection show.
Well, what a fun little add-on there. What a great evening out there watching that. Well, from Rouen, you guys are on to, oh boy, I'm just mispronouncing these, Vernon, France?
Vernon, yes.
Vernon. And how'd you guys spend the day there?
So in the morning, there was an opportunity to go to a place called the Chateau de Bizet, which is essentially a French castle. And we learned something interesting about French castles, that most of them are privately owned, and most of the folks that own them can't afford them. So they said there's this one wing here where the family that owns the castle lives, and they rent the rest of it out for all sorts of excursions and things like that. And ABD basically took over the place and created out in the grounds what was basically a country fair. So they had pony rides for the kids. They had the opportunity to see some chickens and some pigs and things like that. They did tug of war for the kids and for the adults as well, actually. We had stations that had macarons. There was another station that was an ice cream stand. And so it was a morning of just being out in the country and getting to do some of those outdoor things. And then there was also a tour of the public part of the castle. And so you got to see some of the vintage furniture and tableware and things like that they had in the castle itself.
And then that afternoon, it looks like you guys got to see Monet's house and gardens. Now, my wife is a huge Monet fan, and so I've had an opportunity to see his works in a lot of different places. Did you experience that, or what were your thoughts?
We did. So we were back to the ship for lunch, and I made a note. They had mussels on the ship for lunch that day, so bonus there. And then the trip to Monet's house was, I want to be honest about this trip. It was a beautiful place, but it was probably the most disappointing part of the trip, because one of the things that ABD has, I think, always prided themselves on is being able to have special access that you can't get anywhere else. And they did a fabulous job of that with most of the places that we went to. But it was just a nightmare at Monet's house and gardens that afternoon with just the number of people that were there. You could barely move without running into somebody. It was like a really busy day at the Magic Kingdom. And so while it was a really beautiful place and we enjoyed seeing it, the crowds just were not our idea of fun. And it was so bad that when you went through the house, they actually weren't able to give you any sort of narrated tour, because it was essentially a line of people just sort of snaking through the house, and the people that worked there making sure that you kept going and didn't stop too long to look at anything. But I think for people who are Monet fans, it's really a great place to see, because it has the area of the river there where he painted his Water Lily series and the bridge and all those things. And a lot of it's recognizable from some of the works of art that he did. So I'm really happy that we got to see that. It was just, unfortunately, apparently a really busy day there.
Yeah, that's probably one of the downfalls of the summer sometimes, too. You know, things are just so crowded in the summer versus some of the other different times of the year, although that's probably one of the better times with the light and whatnot, I guess.
It was amazing, and it was sort of a cloudy, then not cloudy kind of day, and to sort of just stand there and look out over the water and just see how different everything looks when the sun peeks out from the clouds versus when it's behind the clouds. That was really impressive. I really enjoyed that.
Well said. Well, that night you move into trivia night in the lounge. How competitive was that, and did they give out medals?
Oh my God, Steve.
It was trivia night. There was a group that won. They did not receive medals. I'm not sure what they received. And yes, it was pretty competitive. In fact, there was one kid on the cruise who basically every evening when we had the group meeting, he would ask, "Is tonight trivia night?" And finally, when it was, he was really enjoying everything.
It would be. Well,
the other thing that I forgot to mention is one of the things that they did in the evening before dinner when we got together and did the sort of talking about what's happened is every day they had a photo contest. And they would ask you to take a photo with a certain theme. So one day the theme was be a Viking. Another day the theme was related to Monet. And you would send them the photos during the day, and in the evening they would show the best ones, and then there would be one that would be the award-winning photo, and they would get a little prize for that as well.
Oh, that's kind of cool. That's kind of fun.
Yeah. And one of the other things about the ship that just occurred to me that I think people would want to know is the ship is fully connected to Wi-Fi, and it's part of the cost of the cruise. You don't have to pay extra for that. So whenever you're on the ship, you have Wi-Fi access, and it was actually pretty reasonable Wi-Fi.
Well, we're coming close to the end here. You spend your last day in Conflans before you head over to Paris. What did you guys do there?
So pretty much everyone went to the Chateau Malmaison, which is another castle that's famous because it was Josephine Bonaparte's home. And so you had the opportunity to go through the castle and see all the various pieces of art that they had collected, she and Napoleon, and the furnishings, and then out into the gardens. And it's the place where they still have the descendants of the black swans that she had imported from Australia when she was living in the house. And so we got to see those, which was kind of neat because I think I've only ever seen black swans otherwise in pictures.
Well, from there, you have your choice to either take a coach back to Paris or stay on board the ship to sail, it looks like. And then you have your final evening dinner. Could you talk a little bit about how they end the trip for everybody?
So that evening, there was a little reception with cocktails, and they had a farewell video. Basically, they had taken a number of the pictures that all of the guides had been taking throughout the trip, and they showed them as a video montage. And then after dinner, another special thing that they did, which wasn't on the itinerary, was the captain actually pulled the ship out from the docking area, went a little bit down the river to get as close as possible to the Eiffel Tower. And at a certain point at night, the Eiffel Tower does a light show. And so it has sparkly lights and lasers coming out of the top and all sorts of interesting things. So we got to see that, which was really pretty neat. The other thing that they do in the evening there is give you all the information for what's happening for you the next morning. And so that depends on where you're going. There were some people that were staying in Paris, so they just were told that they needed to be off the ship at a certain time. Everyone had to be out of their rooms by 9 o'clock. Some people were taking flights, and so they had various transports to the airport. Depending on what time your flight was, it might be really early. I think the first group actually had to leave at 5:30 in the morning to get to the airport. There were some people that weren't leaving later in the day. And then we were in the group that was going on to Disneyland Paris that had booked the add-on package that you can get with this trip. And so there was a group of us that were in that group that were told, okay, this is the time that we meet, and we'll take the bus over to Disneyland Paris with you in the morning.
Well, kind of thinking back on this trip then, Frank, do you have any other overall thoughts, I guess, about ABD, river cruising with them, and kind of the trip itself? And then if you have any tips for people that might be experiencing this the first time?
I think this was really one of those trips of a lifetime sort of things. I really think that we saw some amazing things that I don't know that we would ever have had the opportunity to see or experience if we hadn't done a river cruise and if it hadn't been an ABD trip. And so I really think that they did a wonderful job with that. One of the things that I think is important for people to think about is if they have kids and they're planning on bringing kids along, thinking about, are these experiences things that my kids would really enjoy, things that they would remember? Are they really old enough to have a good experience with this? And I think for the most part, the kids that were on the trip really had a good experience as well. The other thing that I think is just worth thinking about is that the ABG trip, I don't think there's any other way to put it, they're really expensive. And so it's like with Disney Cruise Line. We know that we could do the same sort of itinerary with a different cruise line that would be less expensive than going with Disney, but we feel like the added things that Disney has with their cruise ships and all the things that we like about them make that worth it to us. I think there were some people on the trip who sort of felt like, you know, I could have done this with one of these other guided tour countries for much less of a price, and I would have been perfectly happy with that. I don't think we felt that way. I think in the end, we felt like it was really worth going with ABD because of all the special things that they were able to do. Did they have everything down? Was it a perfect trip? No, it wasn't. For example, at the Louvre, we didn't actually get to see the Mona Lisa because they had sort of miscalculated what would be able to be done with that. Some people did finally figure out a way to get there and see her, but I had seen her before, and if you see it in person, it's actually not nearly as impressive as you think it might be.
But really isn't. It's so
but it's
small.
the kind of thing where that was what you expected. And so some people sort of were fixated on that for the rest of the trip. We didn't get to see the Mona Lisa. And I don't think that was the right attitude to take.
What's weird about that, though, is that ABD has been going to Paris for years. So they would know that, even if they didn't do the river portion. Right. So that's odd to me.
What they told us happened is that a week or two before the trip, the museum decided to move the Mona Lisa to a different location. And the way that location was set up was there was only one way in and one way out, and there was no way to bypass that for ABD or get there early or anything like that. And it really turned into one of the big controversies of the trip, because what happened with the people who decided we're going to stick it out, we're going to stand in line for an hour and a half, we want to go see the Mona Lisa. In order to get there, they had to go out of the museum and then back in a different entrance. And when they went out, they weren't allowed back in because they didn't have individual tickets, because we had all gone in through a group entrance. And my understanding is, I wish somebody had videoed this because I would have loved to have seen it, is that the ABD guide just got into a real, not physical, but almost knockdown drag out with the guard that was not going to let those folks get back in, and basically eventually was able to work his French Disney magic and get the opportunity for everybody to get in. But those folks were really not able to do anything else during the free time in the museum because they were trying to get through there to be able to see the Mona Lisa. So is that something that would happen in the future? I don't know. I think there were things that are just unpredictable, and right. I don't fault them for something like that. It's not a situation that really they had any control over. And they did so many other amazing things that I really was overall very pleased with the trip that we had.
So you kind of paint it as a trip of a lifetime. Is this something that you and your wife will do again? Maybe not necessarily the Seine, but another ABD trip or possibly another river cruise trip?
I think it would depend on where it went, what it involved, those sorts of things. I would like to, for example, do one of the river cruises that goes to all the Christmas markets.
Oh yeah.
And I that just looks amazing. And I think we would consider doing that with ABD. I think that would be great. On the other hand, we're looking in the next couple of years to go to the Galapagos. And in looking at a number of the trips that are available, there are just some other companies out there that have itineraries that are much more appealing to us than what ABD happens to offer. So I don't think we would do ABD in that case. But
check out Celebrity with the Flora for the Galapagos. They do a pretty great. They have a pretty great program for Galapagos.
Yeah, that's one of the ones that we were looking at. But there were several that just seemed. There's another one called Classic Journeys that we're looking at that actually seems to spend much more time on the ground versus cruising around to different places. So again, I thought ABD was fantastic. I would have no issues at all doing it again. But it's one of those things where you have to think carefully and plan out. And I'm sure there are people that can afford to do tons of them. There were some folks on the cruise that this was like their 10th or 12th ABD trip, and it seemed like they took one or two a year. I think for many of us, that would probably break the bank. But if you're lucky enough to be able to do it, it's fantastic.
Any final thoughts as we close out, Chrissy?
No, I really appreciate the feedback. It was really nice to live that.
I think the other thing is just if people are interested in a little bit about Disneyland Paris, because we did spend a few days there, that was really a great experience. And we had a really fun time there. There are a number of rides that seem similar to things in the U.S., but are really very different. So their Haunted Mansion, for example, is called Phantom Manor, and it's a very different experience. Their Big Thunder Mountain is way crazier and wilder than the ones that are in the U.S. at either Disneyland or Walt Disney World. It's interesting. I sort of came to the conclusion that safety concerns in general are not nearly as over the top as they are in France. I mean, in France as they are in the United States, because those roller coasters were way wilder than the ones we have here. There were lots of areas where kids were running around and climbing on things and stuff like that. And it's like, the American lawyers that work for Disney would never let them have something like that at Walt Disney World just because of the liability concerns. But the other thing was that they have a different approach to security. everyone goes through metal detectors and X-ray machines. They don't deal with having security people going through bags trying to find things. They just basically have the same level of security to get in there as you would at the airport or any place else like that. So I think that is one way where they're a little bit stricter about things. The other thing about Disneyland Paris that we found very interesting was how much of the attractions and shows were in English. We were expecting that everything would pretty much be in French, but in fact, most of the attractions and most of the shows are, if not all in English, at least mostly in English. And everyone that we came in contact with that worked there spoke English really pretty well, even if it wasn't their primary language. So there was never sort of any issue with this being a park in another country and we're not going to understand what's going on or anything like that. So that was actually a surprise. I almost sort of feel bad for people who are coming there from France and are native French speakers and don't speak much English, because it seemed actually to be geared more to people that were English speakers.
That's interesting. I hadn't heard that as far as the amount of the attractions being spoken in English, I guess. So did you guys... One
example is one of the big things that they were pushing, and from the moment we checked in, they gave us handouts about it, was their Lion King show. That was the big thing for the summer. It was held in one of the huge theaters, and the entire show was spoken and sung in English.
Did you guys stay at one of the Disneyland Paris hotels?
We did. So if you did the ABD add-on, there was an option to stay at one of two hotels. One was the Disneyland Hotel, which is right in the Magic Kingdom, or in Disneyland Park, essentially. And then the other was the Newport Bay Hotel, which was about a 5-10 minute walk around the lake. And we ended up staying out at Newport Bay because it was much less expensive and really didn't have much issue with that. You could walk, or there were buses that ran very regularly to take you down to the parks. And it's in some ways similar to the setup that they have at Disneyland in California. They have a downtown Disney area, and then there are two parks. There's the Walt Disney Studios Park and the Disneyland Paris Park that come off of that. And so everything's sort of there in one area. And it's not like Walt Disney World, where things are very far spread out and you couldn't actually walk between parks or something like that. It's again, more like the Disneyland setup where everything's right there.
I so want to go there. Go ahead, Christy.
No, say it. You can say it.
No, I was just going to say, I so want to go there and do the Phantom Manor. I love the Haunted House, or the Haunted Mansion, excuse me. And
it was.
Yeah, that just looks like an amazing ride. Christy, you had a question. I think I stepped on you.
A note for our listeners, Disneyland Paris is not up on their food allergies. There is very few places somebody with like a gluten situation like I have can eat. So just something for people to keep in mind.
Yeah, I was surprised. The food was fine, but a lot of it was sort of theme park food with a French twist. There were some places that were a little bit more fine dining sort of places, but in some ways it was fairly similar to theme park food, except, and I'm sad to hear that, Christy. That's unfortunate that they don't do a better job with allergies and things like that.
Yeah, I'm hoping it'll get better, as, it hasn't been that long since Disney's owned it or operated it, I guess. So hopefully that'll improve.
Well, as we kind of finally finish up here, any other thoughts overall about your trip, Frank, that you wanted to pass on to people?
No, I just think it's one of those things where people need to investigate, are these places that I want to go? Is this something that seems interesting to me? I think what I recall from seeing some of the promotional material, they're going to be doing the Seine River Cruise a bunch of times next year. It's not just going to be a few trips like they did this year. So there's certainly lots of availability for that. And again, they do a lot of stuff that I think would be really difficult to get all in one trip unless you did something like this. So I really was very impressed with our experience, and everything was seamless once we got there until we were ready to leave. So when we finished up, it was, again, we had our own personal driver that took us to the airport, met us in the lobby, got us there, and we were able to get out. Then it was back to the real world, and unfortunately, the real world is not quite as forgiving. So our flight home ended up leaving Paris about an hour and a half late, which we thought was fine because we had a 3-hour window for our transfer in DC at Dulles, which was where we flew into. But then when we got there, it actually took us another 5 hours to get out of there.
Oh, my God.
So we had expected to get home at about 7 o'clock in the evening. We ended up getting home at midnight. So that was not the greatest way to end the trip. But if you look back on it, if that was the worst thing that was going to happen, then I'm perfectly fine with that.
Well, what is next for you and your wife, Frank? I know that you guys have got something up your sleeve as far as what's coming up next. Where can we find you next?
Gosh, and You don't want to know how many cruises we have booked at this point. Because I think it's 5. Our next trip is actually October. So October is my birthday, and we always go to Walt Disney World for food and wine for my birthday.
As we kind of finish up, any other thoughts, Christy, before we get out of here today?
No, it does want us to make us want to go to Europe, though, doesn't it?
It does, and I think that you've been investigating that, and I can't wait till you guys finally figure out where you guys are going to go to Europe.
We got to figure it out.
Well, thanks again, Frank, for coming on and sharing your and your wife's just amazing Sand River trip with Adventures by Disney, and we look forward to catching up with you after you guys get back on your next cruise on the Beautiful Fantasy.
Sounds great. Thanks, Steve.
Well, that's going to wrap up our show today. Once again, I want to thank Frank, just such a good friend to our show, for coming back on and sharing his and his wife's just amazing sailing as they sailed down the Seine River with Adventures by Disney. If you would like to learn more about Adventures by Disney River Cruising, you can always go to their website, adventuresbydisney.com, and find out more there. Or if you don't have a travel agent, feel free to reach out to Christy at packyourpixiedust.com, and she can help you out with all kinds of information, any questions that you have if you want to sail with Adventures by Disney on their just a magical river cruises. Well, we are headed into the holiday season. We've got one more show about Alaska, I think, coming out here next week. That'll be our next show. And then we've got several listeners who are sailing on very maritime cruises, and we're going to try and bring some of the holiday experiences that they're experiencing out to you in the coming weeks, as well as we head into the holiday season. Or I guess we're already into the holiday season. And if you've been going to Costco, the holiday season has been here since well into, I think, the end of September or so. So just a fun time of the year. We wish you and your families just a great time. Just have a good time with friends and families during this time of year. If you would like to come on our show, you can always reach out to me, Steve, at DCLpodcast.com, and we'll get you lined up to share you and your family's experiences and bring it out to our listeners. And between now and our next show, if you are heading out on your next vacation, all of us here at the DCL Podcast would like to wish you fair winds and safe travels as you head out on your next adventure. Once again, thanks for coming back and taking a listen, and we'll see you next time on the DCL Podcast.